Hello to my friends and audience and family in India, America, and abroad. This is India Insight with Sunny Sharma. That is my podcast name. Today, I'm going to be doing a podcast and YouTube video on President Obama's legacy and objective examination. I wrote this yesterday, May 14th, 2026. This is season 9, episode 7. I'm going to talk a little bit about Obama's legacy, his relationship to past leaders, and a little bit about the voting legislation, a little bit about his fight against the electoral laws, which are unfairly positioning the opposition party against the Democrats, particularly gerrymandering. So here we go. Uh, President Obama's legacy and objective examination. President Obama was a center-left candidate who walked the tightrope between social conservatism and far-left public policy platforms. This is one of the reasons, if you look for admirers and detractors of his policies, you will find people on both sides of these extremities. He was an unconventional candidate, but his broad appeal made people question whether he truly was a real outsider entering the political battleground that was the 2008 presidential campaign. Truly, Obama was never an outsider. Even to this day, he is perhaps the definitive representation of the establishment. However, he never really possessed the moral authority that he so touted, which icons of his carried, such as Nelson Mandela and other Rainbow Coalition figures in American history. In the beginning of his campaign, which may have started much earlier in hindsight at the Boston Democratic National Convention in 2004, he proclaimed at a black church of the moral destitution in American society. This wasn't necessarily a naive statement. He understood that present-day social conditions in American society are much better than any time in history. But more than that, he wanted to challenge citizens to recapture the spirit of change that drove past movements like that of the most recent revolution in American history, the era of the civil rights struggle. Specifically, it was a call to prioritize social duty over social profiteering so as to begin to challenge the immense income inequality in our society, which was the foundational barrier to achieving the beloved community that Dr. King wanted to manifest in the here and now. President Obama may have faltered as a party builder at a time when the Republican Party was starkly opposed to any true bipartisanship. But no one can question that he was a true visionary when it came to developing the blueprint for new social reforms, progressive politics, a rousing philosophy for self-development, and international diplomacy. Few presidents possessed and articulated a political philosophy that mirrored that of the original American founding generation of leaders. President Obama was one of those people. President Obama had the ability to persevere in the here and now for many public policies that were not supported by many representatives and citizens, but he was also concerned with the conditions of generations of Americans for posterity. He envisioned a future through the democratization of the workplace and enhanced political engagement, where even if every marginalized person wasn't heard, there would be an opportunity for all Americans to get a seat at the table of political discourse. President Obama was indeed a political figure, even a political insider, but he had an uncanny ability of relating to a wide swath of people from all walks of life. This may very well be attributed to the fact that he lived in almost every continent of the globe in relatively modest conditions, whereby he was deeply discriminated against during a time when social stigma was much more present. Graduating as president of the Harvard Law Review, he could have been accepted to virtually any entry-level law position across America, but his choice made clear not just his priorities and values, but his keen understanding of history. The theme of voting protections is constant throughout President Obama's career, even till this day. After Harvard Law School, he became involved with the Project Vote Initiative in Chicago to register over 100,000 voters in 1992, which helped several Democrats in Illinois win their elections, including the successful election of a Democrat to the presidency. President Obama always understood the power of the vote, since he read about perhaps the two most transformative periods in American history from a cultural standpoint. The period of abolitionism leading to the Civil War and the end of radical Reconstruction, and the civil rights movement that resulted in the 1960s Great Society legislation. Perhaps more so than any other period in history, these events contested what President Obama calls the imperatives of citizenship. What rights, privileges, and opportunities are afforded to we the people, and just who are the people we are talking about? Today, all three of these notions are being challenged. Who is afforded voting privileges? Who are the we in American democracy? And how can the people exercise their vote in a manner that allows for a collective solidarity of Americans, we, to overcome the current political and economic crisis America faces? President Obama's constitutional expertise made him hopeful that the genius of the people, as outlined in the Constitution, meant that even despite the many challenges American society would face, citizens would choose to create society in line with a more perfect union. It may surprise many Americans to hear that although President Obama signed many executive actions into law, he was deeply skeptical of the power of a centralized government. He felt so strongly about this that he even declared we must return more power to the Congress away from the executive. This seemingly conservative or libertarian sentiment was a recognition that our society, we the people, would ultimately have the final say in the preservation of our democratic experiment in self government. This falls right in line with President Obama's rousing treatise and blueprint of change for future generations, centered on the urgent need for political engagement. President Obama interacted with young people wherever he traveled. He recognized from his travels that the next generation was more predisposed to choose a politics more reflective of generosity and compassion. Even if normal election cycles in America are characterized by overpromising on economic policy, followed by failed delivery, whereby power in the legislature frequently shifts between the two parties, it is clear that President Obama, in many ways, was setting the foundation for a fifth American Revolution, which would implement a more transformative politics. This would only be possible if the next generation not only believes in the six tenets of democracy that President Obama outlined at his 2017 presidential farewell address, including his many lessons for humanitarian citizenship throughout his presidency, but also applies the same degree of sensitivity, thought, and conviction that was so instrumental to President Obama's rise to power and the challenges he overcame while in office. President Obama understood the principle that all serious change happens at a local grassroots level. This idea was internalized during his time as a community organizer for 3 years in a poor community on the south side of Chicago. His job as a community organizer showed him the inefficiencies of government bureaucracy at the city level, which would only become more apparent as he gained bigger and bigger office. His transition from small-town community organizer to House representative to senator to finally president cemented the idea that one voice can change a room. And if one voice can change a room, then it can change a city. And if it can change a city, it can change a state. And if it can change a state, it can change a nation. And if it can change a nation, it can change the world. Your voice can change the world. President Obama was a political voice for change. He could have been a Supreme Court justice, a spiritual leader, or an African diplomat, but he felt that his ability as a politician was a medium for the greatest change at the place and time he was operating in. Yet, it is undeniable that he is a complex figure in terms of the sheer amount of oratory and lessons he conveyed to the general public. Like Frederick Douglass, President Obama used his voice and humor to portray an image for America that was aspirational but seated in realistic political propositions. During the campaign trail, he frequently alluded to the Old Testament, by which he shaped a poetic picture of a liberated world through the Joshua generation succeeding the Moses one. But when he became president, these allegories became rarer. The reason for this is because his public policy program was one of the most ambitious of any past president, seated in pragmatism rather than abstract ideals, and unfortunately, this program was met with the greatest opposition at the same time. Some of his trademark speeches in office spoke to the immense legacy he was leaving behind, such as the final 2016 State of the Union address, which highlighted the 2010 Affordable Care Act and great advances in medical research, drastically reducing unemployment, mass infrastructure and clean energy development, improvements in the auto industry, fostering improvements in the third world for young people and women, unemployment insurance and security for seniors, and so much more that wouldn't fit within an hour timeline. What President Obama was trying to convey in his speech, above all else, was a focus on the future. President Obama concern for future conditions in American society may have been one of the reasons he faltered so much as a party leader. Like previous political thinkers before, President Obama wasn't just a politician, he was a philosopher and prophet of future outcomes. It is difficult to say for future generations what Americans will look back on concerning his legacy. Will it be the 2004 Boston Democratic Convention speech, where he highlighted not just political propaganda and economic exploitation, but the very social attitudes that create this system that undermines excellence among the youth, not to mention a rearticulation of a better and united America, which recaptures the hope of past generations? Will it be his 2008 Cairo speech, when he reached out kindly to the Muslim world, explained that kindness, tolerance, justice, and universal security are shared values by the international community, and that to reach such a community would require a shared commitment to democratic norms and rules of the global order? Perhaps it will be his 2015 Selma speech at the 50th anniversary of the crossing of the Selma Pettus Bridge, which resulted in a clash of wills that eventually led to the passing of the 1965 voting rights legislation, the first time when universal adult franchise in America was guaranteed. At this historic site, President Obama affirmed the unique diversity of American society that made the 1960s such a revolutionary period both intellectually and politically. Furthermore, he understood that every generation can only manage to raise sights and expectations if they challenge the very status quo of society in a manner that stirs conscience to such a degree that it inspires the moral imagination to foster the beloved community touted by Dr. King. President Obama, in his 2005 book, The Audacity of Hope, claimed it is the tree shakers and prophets who are responsible for upsetting the status quo in every generation so democracy can be reborn. Affirming this abolitionist spirit was tantamount to his administration, even if it wasn't always exalted. In his 2016 State of the Union address and 2009 Nobel Prize acceptance speech, President Obama abides by the logic that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final say in the contest between compassionate community and reconciliation versus the very moral destitution he decried 8 years before that has resulted in a blind allegiance to money and power to such a degree that it is commonplace in present-day hegemonic plutocratic America. President Obama claimed there's nothing weak or fragile in the ideology of Dr. King and Mahatma Gandhi. This insight didn't come from an affirmation of rugged American individualism. It was manifested from the idea that the people united can never be defeated. Today, there is a direct challenge to the unity of the American people, not just due to age-old electoral laws, but more specifically, a crisis of community is accelerating due to 3 Supreme Court cases made since 2010, which are destroying the voting power not just of minority blacks, but of all poor and working-class people. Moreover, these cases were most likely established in large part due to the election of the first African American president, Barack Obama, in 2008. President Barack Obama understands, like the founding fathers, that democracy only works in a government with a moral and educated citizenry. This statement is particularly relevant to voting power. That is why he was so focused on the need for citizens to be politically engaged. Yet, unfortunately, most Americans miss this point. We live in a two-party system with so much polarization in the current era that some degree of partisanship is inevitable. However, partisanship is fine as long as it doesn't transform into sectarianism. To be a truly educated partisan, one must be aware of not just the values of potential candidates, but also whether those values align with them. This means both informing oneself of public policy so one is properly educated, and assessing the principles of potential candidates so one is moral in terms of proper conscience. Currently, we live in a society whereby the public education system has consistently been undermined while private school and college tuition has become heavily monetized. President Obama has spoken of the need to enhance civic engagement, financial literacy, and internalize excellence in a system that is evolving so quickly it is difficult to assess how to accommodate it to a rapidly changing population. It follows then that education and voting are inherently linked. The most informed voters are more likely to make better decisions. The Supreme Court has passed 3 disastrous decisions that make minority voting power severely diminished, especially in the place with the greatest history of racial discrimination, the South. The 5-4-2010 Citizens United decision made unlimited donations to super PACs a form of free speech protected under the First Amendment. The 5-4-2013 Shelby v. Holder decision gutted Section 5 pre-clearance clause of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, eliminating the requirement for local jurisdictions and states to get approval from the federal government or Department of Justice before changing voting laws. And most recently, the 6-3 April 29, 2026 Louisiana v. Calais decision eliminated Section 2 of this 1965 Voting Rights Act, making it utterly impossible for black minorities to shape voting districts in proportion to their population, because it is impossible to prove intentional discrimination in the South, where black allegiance to the Democratic Party is the highest. The last decision, 2026 Louisiana v. Calais, is something which President Obama had been foreshadowing for years. Out of all the unfair electoral laws, he was most concerned with that of unfair gerrymandering, the unfair drawing of congressional maps, bypassing the typical 10-year cyclical period when the drawing of maps should occur. Gerrymandering imposes strict boundaries that don't align to complex historical and cultural landscapes that ultimately result in undermining the political power and agency of those communities. Along with his Attorney General Eric Holder, President Obama has called for a renewed fight against these unfair electoral laws. Truly reforming the many unfair electoral laws is the best way to reforming America. Without reforming these laws, the power of the Democratic Party to defeat a Republican majority that is increasingly aligned with a despot in office, there will continue to not just be an affordability crisis across America, but a threat to our democratic tradition. The history and complexities of these judicial cases is quite complex and requires a more in-depth analysis to unearth all the reasons why so much polarization has occurred in American history. Yet President Obama has always affirmed that Americans have more in common than what separates them. Given the typical media barrage, it doesn't always feel this way to most Americans. President Obama has always been an educator, leader, and proponent of constitutional morality and ethical implications of politics. But above all else, he has prioritized approximating the best value systems underlying these principles. If Americans fail to understand the value system of their representatives, it will lead to a degeneration of our society until the people can't take or put up with the current rancorous climate anymore. We are living in such a moment. The next generation is substantially more progressive than any previous generation, but it will take perseverance and urgency to change our society that past generations, led by such leaders as President Obama, developed to not just transform the system, but also to change the social attitudes that created the very same system. Any revolution starts with the individual, and President Obama understood this. Yet, a collective organized social movement requires hope and courage to change our current community. If we want a new series of sweeping legislation passed on behalf of we the people, then we have to implement President Obama's social compact and elect leaders who we can trust. This is only possible if we create a system where everyone's vote matters. President Obama's 2017 presidential farewell address related the warning made by the first American president in Washington in his farewell address concerning the need to preserve our bonds of affection, because from different quarters, great pains will be made to weaken them so as to undermine the liberty of the American people. To President Obama, these bonds of affection were just as sacred as the democratic right to vote. As the leader of the free world, President Obama never truly touted a political revolution in the contemporary understanding of the phrase. His position as a firm constitutionalist and student of history led him to acknowledge the inherent genius of the American people to reform society as they saw appropriate and fit. Every generation comes to doubt this sacred character and power, and for that very reason that the inherent sanctity of the Constitution is put into question is the very reason that it is possible to reform our society. The problem we are facing today is that many of our political leaders adopt the rhetoric of the founders but not their inherent spirit. This means either a strict interpretation of the Constitution that matches a warped historical understanding, or a call by some people to completely demolish the document by which our republic was constructed upon. In either case, the moniker of citizen is unwarranted because these people do not understand the historical circumstances and political precedents of the founding generation. Here are the facts. The founding generation was imperfect, but they were perhaps the last generation of leaders to be situated by character and duty rather than constituency. They certainly were not the only leaders to be thinking of future generations, but they were aptly placed to provide a cultural and political transformation through the groundbreaking precedent they were setting, the establishment of a constitutional system of government. In similar measure, President Obama's being elected as the first African American president was eliciting not only a serious political challenge to a system that marginalized many, but was also developing a cultural change, if not renaissance, in American society. More markedly, he was one of the few presidents who understood not just the extent to which every generation fought for our rights, but he also was able to envision the seriousness by which the founders undertook and contemplated our founding documents for posterity. This was duty, the ability to endure challenge upon challenge without any recognition of the fruits of the labor. It is unlikely that Americans will see another generation host to so many leaders who, although debated fiercely and may have had their own self-interest, were constructing a world for future generations, even if the people they were thinking of were not you in all circumstances. Nonetheless, if President Obama were situated in that time period, he would not have only have been one of the standout leaders, maybe not the first in sophistication, but indeed a stern defender of human rights. In fact, President Obama today is one of the most devoted Americans to the Bill of Rights because it was men like him who drafted it. Thank you for listening to my podcast on the objective examination of President Barack Obama. I really wanted to convey that President Barack Obama has always stood up for the marginalized, and thanks to him and many other members of the Democratic Party, we have a new vocabulary on inequality and on the oppression of billionaires and the tyranny we have in our society. The problem with the plutocratic America and the oligarchy, which is currently presiding over our government at this moment. And to defeat them, we must have a united front of Americans, especially poor and marginalized working class people, to be involved in this movement. And President Obama was one of the people who developed that vocabulary for future generations while also leading them. And so for this may not be my next podcast, but for upcoming podcasts, I will do another podcast on Barack Obama. And some of the things I will highlight in the next podcast are number one, how President Obama set the blueprint for change through the first successfully run social media campaign that emphasized political engagement, including his 6 lessons for America in his 2017 presidential farewell address. That is his treatise on political engagement, which I'll talk about. Number 2, how he set the terms for strategic international diplomacy, smart diplomacy. Number 3, the impact of the organizations he founded, particularly on young people, the Obama Foundation and My Brother's Keeper. Number 4, prison reform and abolition, some of the reforms he made, fighting for the poor, inequality, and immigration reform, including DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And number 5, other key lessons and concepts for the next generation that President Obama developed. So please like and subscribe to my podcast. It helps me spread the message for many of the things I want to talk about, which involve advocating for the right progressive leaders in office, many of whom Obama supports and has sponsored. And Obama has always talked about values. He talks about approximating the best value system, and that if we want to choose the best leaders, we must know what values they abide by and whether those values align with our own values. So I thank you for listening, and I'll be back with another podcast in the future. Thank you.